I have the very profound honor to actually move us into the first section and to introduce our truly amazing keynote speaker. I'm super excited. I'm a fan. In any event, Master McCloud is a master of the Senior Courts, Queen's Bench Division, in the High Courts of England and Wales. And those of you who've attended our last couple of online CBIs, you've seen her presentations before. They are not only very content-rich and incredibly informative, but they are visually always stunning and very innovative. And so I'm excited to have her with us. And if I can ask Master McCloud to come forward and start us off today. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, David and Natasha, for that wonderful introduction. I think I'm a slightly macabre warm-up act, really, given the subject that I'm going to be talking about. I noted that David said unbelievably great. I hope it's not just unbelievable, is perhaps the concern. But I'm going to be talking about disinformation, Russia, Ukraine, war crimes and concealment in the digital space. I'm not going to be too heavy. This is only a very short keynote. As I say, it's really the warm-up for the meat of the conference, but I hope you find it vaguely interesting as a sort of overview. Some years ago, I was lucky enough to be sent by the UK government to be trained to do prosecutorial or judicial work in war crimes, should that ever be necessary. So it's great to be back in the Netherlands for the first time in quite a number of years, especially after COVID. But one of the advantages, actually, of having gone to that event was that I was able to engage with prosecutors from all over Europe. And that included people who had been in Eastern Bloc countries, and it was quite notable that they took sort of a harder line, if you like, than the Northern and Western Europeans, perhaps because they'd come from a background of having been part of the Soviet bloc. So what I'm going to be doing today, speaking about disinformation in the digital space in the context of the ongoing war that we all know about now, obviously, in Ukraine. Europe is for the first time seeing a war of aggression on the borders of the EU, and for the first time, perhaps in many years, one feels that there's a real risk of wider war. So it's a pretty serious subject. Though having said that, that was the news in Newsweek only about 48 hours ago. And our American friends have obviously been turning Ukrainian soldiers into monsters using drugs, which is part of the disinformation campaign that the Russians have been running. And that's Russian lawmakers saying that. And the theme there, if you like, is playing into those sorts of conspiracy theories in a way that perhaps most of us don't really take seriously. So that's me. I've got to give a bit of a disclaimer so that I don't get taken out and taken to the gulag or whatever at home for being understood as speaking on behalf of my government. So you might remember this chap. He didn't last very long. He was the chair. Nowadays he'd be the president of the new Russia, but back then, of course, he was the chair of the Communist Party in Russia in the early 1980s, when I was about 12, 13, and he followed on from the previous chap, Brezhnev, who died. He lasted about a year in that role. He had kidney failure, but before that, he was the head of the KGB, and he actually trained, or was the boss of, Vladimir Putin, as it happened. And he was a great fan of disinformation, and he was also quite repressive in terms of political dissent. And he notoriously once said this: disinformation, desinformatia, forgive my Russian for anyone who speaks Russian, is like cocaine. If you sniff it once or twice, it may not change your life, but if you use it every day, though, it'll make you an addict, a different man. And that comes from quite an informative book called Disinformation. And this use of disinformation has been a regular part, really, of the Soviet tactic and now the Russian tactics in terms of how to address international matters. But it wasn't just a hardliner like Andropov. Some of us may remember, if we're old enough, him, Mr. Gorbachev, still around, of course, and the coining, from our perspective at least, of the word glasnost in the 1980s, when we all thought, well, the coming of a greater openness, and we understand the word glasnost as meaning openness, which in a kind of way it does, but actually it doesn't necessarily mean that. It can also mean control, or if I just go back one, according to the relevant Soviet dictionary at the time, the leading dictionary at the time, it actually can incorporate an element of control, not just openness and discussion. And that's kind of dropped out of our dictionaries now. If you look up a Russian-English dictionary, you won't see that element of control. So Gorbachev, in a sense, had a bit of a last laugh. His role in the Chernobyl disaster, which of course we can presumably all remember, a classic example of glasnost by control of information was this extract from what used to be a secret minute of a Politburo meeting 3 days after the Chernobyl disaster. People involved in it, Gorbachev having to make a decision what to tell the world. Well, we can say, says his advisor, we can say we had minor problems with impermeability during the accident. That's obviously an understatement, to put it mildly. That's right, there are already photographs on Reagan's desk, and then Gorbachev approves that. So even Mr. Gorbachev, who we think of as being open, and we think of him in terms of glasnost and perestroika, was still a practitioner of that art, and it lives on at the time. So let's talk about disinformation and its use in the current war. This was circulated, a pretty good example, at least the first example, I think, of a deep fake being used as disinformation in a way which had any traction. It doesn't take long, I think, when you see a large version of that to start to appreciate that it is only a deep fake. It's a little bit wooden. But this is President Zelensky, of course, of Ukraine, ostensibly asking the troops to lay down their weapons in the days following the invasion. And of course, had that got any traction and had people laid down their weapons anywhere, that would have been pretty fatal. Now, that's quite concerning, because what it actually achieved was this. Not only do commentators believe that actually it's only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the potential for deep fakes, but it was actually carried on Ukraine national news on their 24-hour news station, because hackers were able to insert it into the scrolling news feed at the bottom. So it's the first example, really, of a piece of deep fakery actually gaining any kind of traction, rather than just being immediately picked up. And as it say there, that's from the NPR website, but it was widely reported. And it was inserted along with other material into that scrolling feed that you see typically on the 24-hour news stations. So the first example really of a deep fake that really got anywhere. It was very quickly rebutted, and NATO and Ukraine did a very good job of making it clear that it was in fact a fake, so it didn't actually really gain much more traction than that. But that was, I think, if you like, a near miss. This is a more conventional, very Orwellian example of misinformation in use in the Ukraine war. This is Mariupol, which you'll have heard of in the context of a lot of death that took place there. But this is a propaganda van parked in the town square, and it's broadcasting, if you like, the Russian take on the news for the people of Mariupol. And they drive into the town square, pull up, and display video screens, I suppose, as Orwell might have called them, setting out the, if you like, the Russian take on things. So that's really very conventional sort of propaganda, but digitized and mobile. We've also seen what I'm calling a sort of double-cross digital information. It's a sort of additional layer, if you like, which is where you get disinformation about disinformation. In other words, where you get the rebuttal of what is said to be the other side's fake, but it's actually a fake rebuttal because there never was a fake in the first place. So it's layer upon layer. And in this instance, we've got the Russian mission in Geneva, a verified Twitter account, tweeting a video of the filming of a movie and claiming that that movie was the Ukrainians faking people running away from Russian attacks. And that was tweeted and obviously circulated quite widely. But actually, it was filmed in Birmingham in the UK, and it was a sort of low-budget horror movie, essentially. And the chap who actually did the filming went on and said, "Hang on, that's my film. That's my film." It was literally just a sort of double-layered piece of disinformation, which is. And there's been quite a bit of that. That's not the only example of that sort of thing. Now, I'm going to turn to war crimes and disinformation more specifically in a moment, but you may wonder, well, actually, how do we know? When you saw that propaganda van, how do you know that isn't actually disinformation that I'm giving you? Well, it might be, of course. But just to draw attention to open source information for verifying or attempting to gain at least some degree of confidence in what one sees or doesn't see in information. There's an interesting project, which I'll go to in the next slide, which is the Russia-Ukraine Monitor Map. It's part of what's known as the Eyes on Russia project. And if you go there, what you can do is you can look at different types of incident rated according to severity and the timelines and so on, and those are cross-checked from multiple different sources, which of course can then at least give you some sense that it might be a little more reliable. But of course it could equally be, and I'm sure if there was a Russian representative here, I'm sure they'd say, well, that's Western propaganda. All these news outlets are fake anyway. You know, they're all controlled by the West. From our perspective, I think all we can do is say, is it out there, and is it on multiple outlets that are not controlled by one vested interest particularly? So is it put out by France? Is it put out by Al Jazeera? Can you cross-refer those things? And that's quite a useful website. That's where I got the propaganda van example from. And it's typically visual information that you can cross-check, so photographs of dead people, the van pulling into the town square, that sort of thing, the aftermath of attacks, satellite pictures, all of those sorts of things, and it's cross-referenced and sourced. And it's quite useful for researching that sort of thing. So, let's move on. I want to talk about disinformation in relation to war crimes. Sleepy town of Bucha. I don't want to offend the people of Bucha, but it's a sort of commuter town. Small airport, shops, houses, essentially a sort of suburb of Kiev. Probably hadn't much heard of it really until the events that took place in Bucha. So that's what appears to have happened. The slide has got a little bit messed up, but what it says is that after Ukraine's forces liberated the town, disturbing reports emerged of civilians found lying dead in the streets, in backyards and in mass graves. Some of the victims had their hands bound, some had fatal gunshot wounds to the head, others were beheaded or burned. And amid mounting evidence that Russia's forces had committed atrocities in Bucha, the Kremlin deployed a disinformation campaign to deflect responsibility for the slaughter from its forces. So, following these reports coming out, Russia launches a disinformation campaign. And here's, and that comes from the US Department of State's website, which is quite another useful source about, and I'm sure again the Russians would say, Western propaganda about what is said to be atrocities. So this is an example, one piece of disinformation that was put out there. This was the Bucha mannequin. Another example of using this sort of Hollywood narrative, actually, the conspiracy theory sort of narrative, and it was put out there saying that, well, this is an example, actually, of the Ukrainian forces setting up dummies in order to present a picture of carnage for the purposes of filming and video, so that was then put out there on TikTok and widely spread, especially in Russia. Another example of that disinformation. It was investigated, investigative journalists and so on, and actually tracked down and found that it was something that had been circulated probably by actually a Russian actor who regularly tweets things from behind the scenes at the filming of the movies that he's in. But it's a classic example of reusing existing material that perhaps people might have seen and vaguely remember, but it's a cheap and quick way of putting out disinformation without having to actually go to the trouble of spending money doing it. You just reuse someone else's material, essentially. So, as I say, playing into that Hollywood narrative, if you like, very much as with the Birmingham horror movie that I mentioned. Other examples, again, this is from the US Department of State. The message was put out there that bodies that were found didn't have rigor mortis and therefore must have been only recently killed by the time the Ukrainians claimed to have found them. In fact, rigor mortis subsides after about 4 days or so. And the other narrative that got some traction was that the bodies were only first seen 4 days after the Russians had withdrawn from Bucha, so they must have been put there by the Ukrainians. But that's rebutted by the availability, of course, of NATO and US satellite evidence that actually shows the bodies in place on the streets at the time. So what about the meat of it then? What about digital operations actually as war crimes themselves or as parts of war crimes? Well, typically, to be a war crime, you generally understand it as meaning personal injury or death. Sometimes physical destruction, but by and large, war crimes focus on injury and death, typically by kinetic means. In other words, bullets, bombs, missiles, those sorts of things. Unsurprisingly, because that is warfare as we have known it. It's not an entirely static position. The Tallinn manual, currently in its second edition, is a book. It's on the international law applicable to cyber operations, is its title, and it was put together by a group of experts. The current edition dates from 2017, so it's only 5 years old, but even in that time things move on. And the foreword to the book stresses that nowadays, in the digital domain, we do recognise that international law can apply to disinformation. And I hope I'm going to pronounce this right. Bert Koenders, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Netherlands, wrote this: "In the past, in times of war, the law falls silent," was an oft-heard claim. More recently, some have argued that the law falls silent in the face of the challenges of the digital age. Neither assertion is correct. States have developed a body of law that regulates armed conflict, commonly known as international humanitarian law, and they've also recognised that existing international law applies in the digital domain. So I want to talk about, I've got 5 areas that I've identified where it seems to me that disinformation or fake data, and I'm kind of lumping them together, disinformation or fake data could potentially be part of or be actually a war crime. And this is sort of boundary stuff in the sense, certainly that last point where we're talking about civil or protected infrastructure, that's quite controversial. I'll come to that point last. But the 5 areas that I'm going to refer to as potentially being areas where disinformation can be or form part of war crimes are part of what's known as treacherous or perfidious killing or wounding, the digital misuse of protective indicators, and I'll explain what that is, fake information in order to conceal what's known as cyber booby traps, which trigger death or injury, non-directed cyber attacks using digital fakery, and the last one, which I say is more borderline in terms of the legal position, fake data to misdirect or corrupt civil data systems, infrastructure, if you like. So let's talk about perfidious or treacherous killing. Lovely word, perfidious, perfidy. To my mind, it's one of the worst war crimes in a sense, because what it is it's playing the rules, if you like. It's using the rules of war themselves as a weapon. So if you like, it's double bad. The Geneva Conventions have long said that it's beyond the pale. Geneva Conventions, perfidy is an act inviting the confidence of an adversary to lead him or her to believe that he is entitled to or is obliged to accord protection under the rules of international law applicable in armed conflict with intent to betray that confidence. So, in other words, the classic one would be pretending to be wounded and then not actually being wounded. In circumstances where your opponent believes that he or she is under a duty to come and help you because you are hors de combat, you're no longer able to fight, and under the Geneva Conventions, you have to be accorded, as far as possible, medical care and so on. So it would be perfidious to feign being wounded or feign putting down your arms and then triggering that duty on the other side and then misusing it. There are multiple sources of this sort of thing. I mean, the Geneva Conventions tend to be, if you like, one of the source of the international humanitarian law. But what can make it criminal is, for the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court, killing or wounding treacherously individuals belonging to the hostile nation or army. And perfidy and treachery are typically used interchangeably. It's dishonourable. Now, the Tallinn Manual moves that into the cyber domain. The way the Tallinn Manual works is that, being an academic work by a bunch of experts, they put forward what they call rules, and they're not actually legal rules, they're principles, really, the sort of thing that we familiarly see in law books. So they're proposed, but it's a book to which a good deal of weight is accorded. They propose Rule 122. In the conduct of hostilities involving cyber operations, it's prohibited to kill or injure an adversary by resort to perfidy and acts that, and then it repeats the expression about acts that invite confidence. You can imagine that it would be possible to use cyber techniques to give an example, to lead your opponent to believe that they're safe, for example, and then turn on them. So here we have this. That was a statement by the Russian Ministry of Defense, 25th of April, confirming, official statement confirming that the previously opened and permanently operating for the 36th day round-the-clock humanitarian corridor for the Azovstal metallurgical plant. Now, you may remember that was the plant with a lot of underground tunnels and corridors, and there were a lot of civilians down there. And it was essentially besieged. That second paragraph perhaps is the operative one. At the same time, the armed forces of Russia and the formations of the Donetsk People's Republic from 1400 hours, April 25th, 2022, unilaterally cease hostilities. Units are to withdraw and ensure the withdrawal of the specified category of citizens in any directions they choose. And then that final paragraph, the Russian Federation publicly and officially declares there are no obstacles to the exit of civilians from Azovstal, except for the principal decision of the Kiev authorities themselves, and commanders of nationalist formations to continue to hold civilians as a human shield. I think there's a degree of sarcasm there, actually, in that last line. But what it's doing is it's giving assurance that there is safe passage, in particular under a flag of truce. But then what happened? Well, the next day there were attacks. People were killed while escaping, and the allegation by Ukraine was that this had actually been a trap. So people had been led to believe it was safe, and then shelling and bombing took place. Now, whether that is perfidy or not is a different question, because there's a question of intent. Was it actually a trap? Was it set up as a trap, or was it an example of just incompetence or miscommunication? And as with much criminal law, of course, there is a mental element that has to be proved for that. But certainly the facts, if you like, fit a certain template, which, subject to proof of intent, would at least be capable of being fixed with the moniker of war crime. Now I want to talk about protective indicators. Well, a classic protective indicator is the flag of truce, the white flag. There are other protective indicators, and we'll come to those in a minute. But they are images, literally images, logos, which in international law carry certain meanings and have certain legal effects. The Rome Statute, again, translates that into crime, making improper use of the flag of truce and so on. And then the Tallinn Manual, again, translates that into the cyber domain, and perhaps unsurprisingly, it would be regarded as unlawful to misuse one of these protective indicators in a digital sense. That's, in a sense, quite straightforward and quite easy to see how that might happen. Here are some of the protective indicators. Not surprisingly, what you've got there is the Red Cross, for example, the Red Cross, the Red Crescent. There are some others that you might not be aware of. For example, the 3 dots on the right, works and installations containing dangerous forces. So nuclear facilities, dams, that sort of thing. So it's a warning that attacking that could lead to disproportionate consequences. There are also indicators for protecting particularly significant items of cultural property, markings for hospitals and so on. Well, what's happened in this war so far? Well, the OSCE, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, produced a report in April, having received reports that in the course of the Ukraine war, there had been use by troops of the Red Cross emblem to mock military non-medical vehicles, use of the other side's flags, which is actually also largely banned, especially when in sight of the enemy, white flags, civilian clothes, and other symbols to facilitate OSCE operations, military operations. Now, it can't be said that those are necessarily war crimes, because these have to be used in such a way that actually causes harm. And I think in the example of the Red Cross emblem that's given there, I think it was actually used for the purposes of moving children out of the area. So although those were military vehicles and non-medical, the intent wasn't there, if you like, to be maliciously misusing it. Although the OSCE report does go on to say that there is evidence that the white flag was misused in an unlawful way. So I want to move on now to cyber booby traps. This is rather more hypothetical at present, although arguably it's come close to having happened in Ukraine. This is what the Tallinn Manual says about a cyber booby trap. It actually comes from quite old law on leaving mines and attaching explosive devices to items that mislead people into thinking that it's a typically safe item. And it's defined as being any device or material which is designed, constructed, or adapted to kill or injure, and which functions unexpectedly when a person disturbs or approaches and performs an apparently safe act. Now, the example that's given here in the Tallinn Manual would be where, for example, someone at a hydroelectric dam receives an email that appears, I think it's called spear phishing, which purports to be from his doctor. He opens it, it triggers a cyber attack, turns off, for the sake of argument, decontamination systems, and then that causes injury, whether to soldiers or civilians. Now, that would be an example, as far as I know, that hasn't specifically happened, but it's a hypothetical example of how a digital system could lead to a war crime in that domain. The reason being that to be an unlawful booby trap, it has to be associated with a number of protected objects or specified objects. So religious sites or functions, medical matters, food and water, things which civilians would typically regard as safe, such as children's toys. If you were to leave an explosive teddy bear, that would be a booby trap, because the typical civilian would be misled into thinking that it is a safe object. Now, what about the situation in Ukraine? Well, what we have seen, what we'll see later, but what has actually happened in the past is fake information. I'm moving on to the next topic because this kind of overlaps with the booby trap situation. So, non-directed cyber attacks can lead to indiscriminate consequences. Now, the damn example of the booby trap would be kind of non-discriminate consequences as well, because it's not capable of being targeted. And in international law, if you use a method which can't be limited in its effect or controlled so as to be aimed against a military target and have controllable effect, then that is disproportionate and can itself be a war crime. Now, this overlaps with the booby trap example for obvious reasons in the example of the dam. And this is where I say that there's been something a little close to this in Ukraine. This wasn't in the current conflict, but of course the Ukraine war is actually a war that's been going on for several years now with the invasion of Crimea. And we saw the Ukrainian power grid partly knocked out following a cyber attack, and indeed the radiation monitoring systems at Chernobyl were taken down as a result of a cyber attack as well. Now, in the case of the electricity grid attack, in particular, that does seem to have been an attack that was specific rather than the Chernobyl matter, which was actually a side effect of a more widely known hack that affected lots of people around the world. But this one appears to have been more directed, and it was launched by way of malicious code in emails. So very much like the dam example, an email arrives that is an apparently harmless routine piece of administration, launches the cyber attack, and as it says there, it is the first publicly acknowledged attack that used a digital weapon to hit a power grid. So it is quite close, really, to that dam example. The distinction there is it might be difficult to prove the direct causation of death or injury, although it might be fair to say that you could infer it, because if you cut off power supplies, someone's going to get hurt. And it's likely to be an expanding area of jurisprudence as to how far you can stretch that chain of causation when you're not talking about a kinetic attack, when you're talking about a digital attack of that sort. Now, this last one is the one I said was a little bit more controversial. Can we have war crimes which are purely digital? In other words, ones which don't necessarily result in traditional physical injury or death? And academic authors, there's a couple I've cited there, and the references come at the end of the slide, have posited that perhaps for the next edition of the Tallinn manual, we're going to have to consider the sheer significance of civilian infrastructure data systems. If you think about depriving people of access to their bank accounts, depriving people of access to medical records, perhaps by just corrupting the database, pointing one medical record at somebody else's medical record, messing up the structure of bank account databases, messing up food supply logistics by arranging for the wrong things to go to the wrong places and just causing chaos in that way, causing traffic chaos by bringing down control systems and so on. Those things can cause greater societal and economic damage than a bomb, and yet on the face of it they fall outside current conventional notions of what is a war crime. The Red Cross has pushed rather more towards saying, well, there ought to be a broader definition of these things. So authors, as I say, like Kilovati and Beattie have strongly argued that we need to evolve in this domain and move away from this narrow notion of what amounts to a war crime. In other words, the old-fashioned kinetic notion, the hand grenade, the bomb, the bullet, whatever. And just by way of a sort of a closing point, I understand actually that the legal group in the international, at Berkeley, have put in a brief actually to the International Criminal Tribunal arguing that there have been digital war crimes in the Ukraine, but that is a developing area. I hope that's been vaguely interesting, as I said, a slightly macabre warm-up act, and thanks ever so much for having me.